The room had not changed in 33 years, except that everything inside it had stopped pretending to belong to the present. Dust softened the edges of the overturned chair, dulled the silver frame of the photograph on the floor, settled in a thin veil over the dark stain on the warped hardwood. The air carried a dry, paper-like smell, as if the house itself had been filed away and forgotten. Detective Michael paused in the doorway and let the silence press against him, a silence that remembered exactly where he had stood the first time. Back then, in November 1992, he'd been a younger man with a sharper suit and a louder certainty. Back then, the house on the outskirts of Virginia had buzzed with uniforms and low voices and the click of cameras. Now, the only sound was the faint hum of his own breathing and the distant rush of traffic from the highway that hadn't existed when the crime was fresh. The file had called it a single word: homicide. The woman at the center of it all had once been alive and busy, but the file reduced her to victim, Hale L. female, 27. Date of incident, 11/06/1992. Location, 124 County Road. Her name had been Lydia Maris Hale, 27, graduate student in environmental planning at Virginia Tech, back in town for a weekend to visit her parents' old farmhouse and decide if she would sell it. A scholarship winner, a volunteer at the local library, the kind of person people described as reliable and kind in the statements tucked into the file. Reliable, kind. None of those words had ever turned into answers. Stepped inside, careful, as if the evidence might still be waiting and fragile. His shoes creaked on the floorboards. He had been here on the second day of the original investigation, assigned as a junior detective to assist the lead. The house had been bright with afternoon light that day, reflective tags everywhere, technicians bending and photographing. Now it was late afternoon in another century. The light that filtered through the gauzy curtains was the color of old paper. Motes drifted in it, slow and unbothered. He walked to the center of the living room, where the outline once marked the position of Lydia's body. The tape was long gone, but he could still see it in memory. One hand near the fallen picture frame, face turned slightly toward the front door, as if she had been about to get up, about to greet someone. There had been little sign of struggle reported, no forced entry, no valuables missing. The medical examiner had ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma from a single strike to the head, with an object never recovered. The case had started with a long list of possibilities and slowly drained itself of hope. No fingerprints that didn't have an innocent source, no clear enemy in her life, no confession, no second crime to link it to. The town stirred for a few weeks, whispered, speculated. And then, because people have to live, they moved on. The murder of Lydia Hale became a folder in a cabinet in the police department, one among many. Over time, it migrated from the active shelf to the cold case shelf. It gathered dust the way this room had, the same slow, indifferent settling. Had gone on to other investigations, promotions, years of steady work. Yet this address, this room, had never entirely left him. Sometimes, entering a new scene, he would hear a faint echo of this one, the sudden hush when the first responders stepped back and the detectives stepped in, the weight of realizing that the dead could never clarify their own story. Now, standing in the stale quiet again, he felt that old weight return, but different. He was no longer the junior detective in the background. Most of the officers who'd worked the case had retired or left. Some were gone altogether. He moved slowly, touching nothing. The farmhouse had been in probate limbo for years, then entangled in a distant cousin's finances. It had stayed locked, uninhabited. That, the sheriff had said, was a strange kind of luck. Same place, murmured, his voice sounding small in the empty room. Same questions. No one answered. He stopped near the window, where the gray curtain swayed a few centimeters in a draft. Outside, 6 acres of dormant land rolled away to a tree line, bare branches marking the horizon. November again, just like back then. The symmetry felt both neat and cruel. He turned toward the doorway that led to the narrow hall, and beyond it, the small office where Lydia had kept her books and papers. That room had been important the first time. It was important again now. Because the case was no longer just an old failure. Something had changed. Something small on paper, but large enough to bring him back here, 33 years later, to a room that refused to be finished with what it had once held. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The call had come 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning that was otherwise unremarkable. Had been at his desk, working through a newer case, when the sheriff leaned against the doorway of his small office with a file in hand. "Got something strange for you," the sheriff had said. "Name ring a bell, Lydia Hale." The name had cut through the room's routine like a sharp intake of breath. Looked up, the fluorescent light washing everything in pale color. "She's been dead longer than some of our patrol officers have been alive," he replied. "What about her?" The sheriff came in, closed the door with a soft click, and set a thin, newer folder on top of his current stack. A red evidence review stamp marked the front. "County records are digitizing old property files," the sheriff said. "Some clerk boxes up a bunch of old case documents from the Hale estate, tax paperwork, appraisal photos, the usual. One of the interns runs them through a scanner and flags something odd, sends it to us." Opened the folder, careful, as if it might shift a balance he couldn't yet see. Inside was a color printout, a scan of an old photograph that had been stuck, apparently, between pages of a property assessment file for the farmhouse. The picture showed the Hale living room in 1990, 2 years before the murder. The furniture arrangement matched what he remembered from the crime scene photographs, minus the disorder. Lydia sat on the floor near the coffee table, smiling faintly at something off camera. In the background, reflected in the glass of the framed landscape above the couch, a figure stood in the doorway. The reflection was small, blurred by the angle and the cheap camera, but it was clear enough to show a man's outline. Broad shoulders, a distinctive tilt of the head. The real detail, though, was lower. On his left wrist, catching the flash, was a thin band of light in the shape of and just beneath the sleeve, a narrow bracelet with a central charm, a simple, asymmetrical circle. Exhaled slowly. "I don't remember this being in the original file," he said. "We went through every photo in the house." "It wasn't," the sheriff replied. "This came out of the county's property folder, not from the criminal case. Best guess, it was taken during a home insurance assessment. Date on the back is August 90. The photo itself was misfiled, stuck between pages. No one caught it because they weren't looking for it." Studied the reflection again. The bracelet drew his attention like a line of underlined text in an otherwise calm paragraph. "We have someone in the old witness statements who wore something like that," the sheriff went on. "At least, that's what our younger folks say. They ran the photo through their software, enhanced it as much as they could without turning it into fiction. Then they cross-referenced the description with the case notes." Turned the page. Behind the printout was a brief report from the department's part-time analyst, a recent hire who split her hours between data entry and cold case review. Her summary was simple. Possible correlation between reflection in 1990 photo and witness description of male acquaintance, seen with victim in late October 1992. Witness, Mary Jean Collins, neighbor. Interview dated 11/08/1992. Statement, he wore this little bracelet thing on his wrist. Never seen a man wear one like that before, kind of a round charm on it. Back then the detail had been noted but not chased hard. Men wore many things. The acquaintance's name had been incomplete, Tom or Tony, something like that, according to the neighbor, and no one had identified him. Remembered the page. He remembered thinking at the time that it was too thin to hold. New tech, old paper, the sheriff said. The analyst thinks it might justify a reclassification of the case status. Cold but active. You want it reopened, said. I want to know why this man was in her house 2 years before she died, and why we never heard about him from anyone else, the sheriff replied. You were here in '92. You know where the gaps are. The request was formalized within days. A cold case review, authorized by the county and accompanied by a small grant from a statewide initiative to clear old unsolved files. There were criteria for these reviews: seriousness of the crime, potential for new evidence, availability of surviving witnesses. Lydia's case ticked every box. The reopening was not theatrical. No press conference, no headlines, no revelation to the town. It began with something more modest, a transfer form moving a box from the records room to his office, a digital flag that shifted the case from closed, unsolved to active, cold review. He opened the original box on a quiet evening, the building nearly empty. The scent inside was faint but distinct. Old paper and cardboard, a trace of the adhesive from evidence seals. Inside, the familiar artifacts, crime scene photos, autopsy report, transcripts of interviews, the thin list of initial suspects, all long cleared or abandoned for lack of proof. Each item was a frozen decision from another time. He laid out the photo again, Lydia on the floor, the reflection in the frame. The bracelet was no longer just an odd detail. It was a constant, a fixed point in 2 separate moments, a reflection in 1990, a witness remark in 1992. Cold cases often reopened because of new DNA techniques, preserved samples, or confessions. This one reopened because of a small, gleaming circle on a wrist, captured accidentally in the corner of an old photograph. Found something both restrained and unsettling about that. The logic was clear. The emotion was quieter, buried, but present. The image turned the unknown man from a shadow in a statement into a person who had stood in the house, who had shared a private space with Lydia. The farm hadn't changed much in the public record. The land had stayed under the Hale name for years, frozen by disputes, then held by a distant relative who never moved in. The farmhouse itself remained sealed except for occasional inspections. That was why, when the sheriff requested a new search warrant based on the photograph and the analyst's report, the judge signed it without hesitation. Minimal disturbance, targeted re-examination of prior scene, the order stated. Which was how, on a dull November afternoon in 2025, found himself back inside the house where the case had begun. Not because of sudden inspiration, not because of a confession from a guilty conscience. The case reopened for a quieter reason, a small object repeated across time, asking to be acknowledged. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. Back at his desk, after that first return to the farmhouse, lined the reports in a neat row across the surface. Years of paperwork had trained his movements into something almost ritualistic. He began not with the new photograph, but with the earliest document in the original case file, the initial incident report. 11/06/1992, 21:14 hours. Call received from neighbor Collins, Mary Jean, reporting concern over uncollected mail, lights left on overnight and no answer at door. Officers dispatched, patrol units 3 and 7, entry gained at 2142 with neighbor present, victim located in living room. He read the lines twice, then set the report aside. He could imagine the scene with a clarity that undermined the dry language. The officers had done what was expected, secured the area. Detectives called in forensics. Their notes were methodical, if unspectacular. Moved to the canvas reports, the interviews with neighbors and acquaintances. He took a pen and a yellow legal pad, copying names in a column on the left. Collins, Mary Jean, neighbor. Edwards, hardware store owner. Co-worker at library. Hale Samuel, uncle. Tom or Tony, unidentified male friend, possibly from college. Beside each name, he left space for new notes. He started with Collins, the neighbor who had first called in the concern. The transcript of her main interview was 8 pages. She talked about Lydia warmly, with small practical details. How Lydia liked to arrive late on Friday evening, how she watered the front porch plants first thing in the morning, how she always waved at passing cars. On page 4, near the bottom, was the line the analyst had highlighted in the recent report. There was a man there a couple of times that fall, before it happened. He drove a dark car, not the kind you see much around here. Foreign, maybe. He wore this little bracelet thing on his wrist. Never seen a man wear one like that before, kind of a round charm on it. The original detective's note in the margin, written in blue ink now faded. Follow up on male friend from Blacksburg, possible boyfriend. Had they followed up? The next few pages contained attempts. Reference to a phone call to a listed number at Virginia Tech, a message left, no reply. A record of an inquiry sent to campus housing, looking for any Tom or Tony connected to Lydia during her time there. Nothing definitive. In 1992, without a full name, distance itself had been an obstacle. Underlined the bracelet description on his pad. The word foreign next to the car caught his eye, but he bracketed it lightly. In a rural county, foreign could mean almost anything not made in Detroit. He turned to the interview with the co-worker from the library. Her recollection was quieter, less animated but consistent. Lydia reliable, punctual, sometimes distant, often immersed in her work. One paragraph near the end stood out. She had this small photo on her desk for a while. Not a family, some landscape maybe. She said someone had taken it up near the Blue Ridge, and it reminded her of, I don't know, of wanting to leave and stay at the same time. She moved it into her bag one day and never brought it back. No mention of a man, just the idea of departure, of split attention between and somewhere else. Next, the uncle, Samuel Hale. His statement focused on practical matters, the property, the inheritance, Lydia's intention to decide about selling the farm. He spoke well of her in a restrained way. No mention of a bracelet, a foreign car, a man from college. Circled the absence on his pad. People reveal as much by what they omit as by what they state. He shifted to the crime scene log. Every item collected or photographed had been listed and numbered. CS01, blood sample living room floor. CS02, fiber sample sofa cushion. CS03, fingerprint lift coffee table partial. CS04, photograph framed landscape wall above couch. CS05, photograph silver frame fallen near victim's right hand. Item CS05 was the photograph he remembered well, a black and white portrait of Lydia as a teenager, taken in front of the farmhouse porch. CS04 was the framed landscape in which the newly found picture had caught a reflection 2 years earlier, before the crime. He checked the notes from the original evidence technician. The landscape photograph had been removed, examined, and replaced. The frame had been dusted, the glass inspected. No usable prints, no mention of any prior image or a reflection of interest. The detail that now mattered had been invisible then, not because it wasn't physically there, but because no one had asked the right question of it. He opened the autopsy report next. The language was clinical, as expected. Victim Hale Lydia Maris. Age 27. Height weight 165-56. Cause of death blunt impact trauma to left parietal region of the skull. Single strike. No defensive wounds observed. No defensive wounds. That, if anything, was a loud data point. It suggested that Lydia had either not seen the strike coming, had trusted the person near her, or both. Jotted. No forced entry. No defensive injuries. Victim in relaxed clothing, per scene photos. The combination suggested familiarity. She had allowed someone inside. She had remained unguarded. He moved to the list of early suspects. There were 3 main lines. 1. A local handyman who had done small repairs on the farmhouse. Cleared after time-stamped records placed him out of county that weekend. 2. A former boyfriend from high school, briefly considered due to past arguments. Cleared by alibi and lack of recent contact. 3. Unknown male, potential acquaintance from college, mentioned in Collins' statement. This line ended with a short notation. Insufficient identifying data, no further action possible. That last sentence, more than any other, irritated him now. Not because it was unreasonable at the time, but because it had closed a door too neatly. He pulled the new photograph from its protective sleeve and placed it beside the transcript. The reflection in the glass showed only the man's outline and that glint at the wrist. Was it enough to build a full identity? No, but it was enough to move the description from insufficient to underdeveloped. Technology could sometimes repair old neglect, but only if someone chose to look again. Opened a fresh folder on his computer and began a new document. Case 921106, Hale Lydia, Cold Case Review Notes. He typed in headings. Witness Statements, Reanalysis. Potential Patterns, Timeline. Overlooked Correlations. Under Witness Statements, the line about the bracelet verbatim. He added the library co-worker's mention of the landscape photo. He noted the uncle's silence on any social relationships. Under Potential Patterns, he began a rough chronology, not of the crime itself, but of the months leading up to it. August 1990, insurance photograph taken. Reflection of unknown male with bracelet in landscape frame. Fall 1992, neighbor observes unknown male visiting farmhouse a couple of times, notes bracelet and foreign car. November 6, 1992, body discovered. The dates left a gap, but the pattern was there. A persistent but undocumented presence in Lydia's life, connected both to the house and perhaps to the decision that had brought her back that final weekend. Rubbed his forehead, feeling not dramatic revelation but a slow, steady tightening of focus. Cases did not usually break open from a single dramatic clue. They shifted under the weight of accumulating small consistencies. One more detail, minor at first glance, surfaced when he reread the patrol officer's supplemental notes. An officer had recorded that the front door showed no sign of forced entry, but the back door off the kitchen had a slightly worn latch. Not broken, just worn, sticks and less lifted, as the note described. The implication: anyone familiar with the house would know the small movement needed to open it quietly. He added that to the list. Backdoor latch requires specific lift to open. Lydia's close relatives and long-term neighbors would know that. So would anyone who had spent time in the house with her. The case, viewed through these quiet fragments, began to feel less like a mystery and more like a problem of discipline. Not who could have done this, but who moved easily through these specific details of her life. The bracelet, the foreign car, the photograph taken in 1990, the latch on the back door. None of it was proof, but together they suggested lines of inquiry left underdeveloped in 1992. Lines that, if followed slowly and without expectation, might converge on someone who had once seemed too vague to pursue. Closed the file for the night, not with the satisfaction of discovery, but with the measured sense that the silence around Lydia's death had shifted, slightly. Not broken, not yet, but cracked enough for questions to slip through. The list began as a column of names, but as expanded each entry into fuller notes, the shapes of people began to return, not as they had been in life, but as the case had once framed them. Fragments of statements, habits, patterns. Cold cases held people in place like insects pinned for study. The first interview he revisited was with Edwards, the hardware store owner who had repaired a section of the farmhouse roof the previous summer. In 1992, he had volunteered information readily, explaining he'd left the job mostly finished, planning to return in the spring. His tone in the transcript was straightforward, a man eager to stay clear of anything that might involve official scrutiny. His alibi had been checked, receipts from a weekend fishing trip 3 counties over. In his recorded interview, he seemed genuinely startled when asked if he'd known Lydia well. "No, sir," he'd said. "She was polite, that's about it, didn't talk more than needed." Marked him again as unlikely but not dismissed. Cold casework required no certainties, only patience. Next came the library co-worker. Her statements in 1992 aligned with her reputation: steady, meticulous, private. She had arrived the morning after the body was discovered, eyes red, insisting she should have noticed something. Her alibi had 2 corroborating witnesses, both colleagues. Still, in the margins of the old notes, saw something he'd not paid attention to years ago. Asked multiple times whether the farmhouse will be searched again, concerned about papers the victim kept. Papers, that could mean anything, but the repetition felt deliberate, added a question mark beside her name. Then there was Samuel Hale, the uncle. His statement had been brief, and his presence in the case minimal. In the transcript, he spoke about family obligations and the burdens of inherited property, resentments delivered in the calm tone of someone long accustomed to maintenance, paperwork, and quiet disagreements. He had been in Richmond the weekend of the incident, a detail confirmed by credit card logs from the hotel where he stayed for a conference. He had shown no unusual behavior during the follow-up interviews. And yet, something about his reserve carried a shade of distance that noted again. People could be truthful without being transparent. But the name that mattered most, the one that had remained unanchored for 33 years,